Mayor Allen, we may start at any moment.
Thank you. I'll call the meeting to order. Can I have a mover and seconder to do that, please? Councillor Ma and Councillor Ritchie, that the special meeting of the Council of the Township of Springwater, November 4th, come to order at 5:15 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Due to COVID, we're taking the necessary steps to limit in-person meetings, and therefore Council is participating in the meeting electronically. The meeting is being live streamed, and residents can see that on www.springwater.ca, or you can listen to the meeting by telephone by calling 647-558-0588 and use the ID 847-6496-4244 #. This option is only available during the meeting, and those unable to watch the live stream can review the meeting at their convenience by watching the video on the Township's YouTube channel, which there is a link for on the website. Are there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? All right, we move on to deputations presentations. I now call upon Gary Scandlin and Daryl Abbs of Watson & Associates to provide council with the presentation on the water and wastewater rate study, and I apologize that we're a little late in starting. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to ask Daryl if he can work the presentation. That would be very helpful, please. Be able to take control, Daryl? There we go. Can you put it into presentation mode?
Sorry, Mayor Allen, I can only see a few members of council. Is Councillor Cabral joined us?
Yes, I'm having the video issue here, so I'll turn it on when I figure it out.
Okay, yes, thank you.
I have audio though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you put it into presentation mode, please, Daryl? It'll make it bigger.
Apologies, I thought I did.
There. Yep, appreciate that. Thank you. So the next slide. So we are happy to be before you. We wanted to chat before we finalize the background study, is to give you some initial insights into our calculations and to I guess have you consider a couple of different options with respect to wastewater. I think as we go through, the water component is looking in pretty good shape. The wastewater, there are some considerations that we need to discuss with you. So we'll be taking a look at the, in the analysis we're providing, we'll look at the capital forecast needs. Obviously, you've got existing issues or existing needs, which may come from improvements associated with replacing older infrastructure or changes in legislation, et cetera. So there's a component of it which really is to benefit the existing water and wastewater users. Then there's the growth component, and you've got a sizable amount of growth anticipated in the municipality, but for the most part, we'd be looking to the developing landowners to finance those costs. So we'll go through that with you. We'll look at also the operating costs over the next 10 years. Initially, your costs for the next few years are probably somewhat stable, but as you go through considerable growth, there'll be some upward pressures on your day-to-day operating expenditures. So the cost of hydro, chemical, staff, et cetera, tends to be impacted by significant levels of growth. So we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll look at the impact rates, and we seek to get your direction on a go forward basis. Next slide, please. Just keep in mind that municipalities across Ontario, after the Walkerton crisis, you remember back in 2000, we had that unfortunate situation in Walkerton where there was a well supply that ended up getting contaminated, and it affected the community of 5,200. So 4,700 people sick, 7 people died. As a result of that, there was a huge inquiry which has laid the foundation for considerable amount of legislation that we now must work with. The Safe Drinking Water Act, the first one, actually the first and second bullet were introduced during the middle of the hearings. The Safe Drinking Water Act is the one that basically governs the water system by all service providers on a day-to-day basis. So this regulates, excuse me, the level of cleansing of the water. So basically chlorination or whatever your alternative is, provides that you must be training your a certain number of hours of training for every staff person every year, minimum standards on flows and such. So all of the, this regulates not only you, but also provides for the water industry who does the testing, et cetera. There was the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the second one there, we call it SWISA, that came into play as well, that talks about doing a asset management plan, so a longer term inventory and assessment of your assets, and then look to provide a financial plan for the replacement of those assets. That piece of legislation, basically, there was a changeover in the government. The Liberals replaced the then Conservative government. They went through a process to evaluate things. But at the end of the day, they didn't move forward with that legislation. And but they have replaced it before it expired with the Water Opportunities Act. So I'll talk to the Water Opportunities Act, which to some extent gives you the same principles, but maybe not the depth. The Ontario Regulation 453 is one where you have to do it's an interim piece of legislation, and it deals with that financial plan that was originally expected through SWISA. But because the province didn't complete their process, they put in this interim piece of legislation. So there's a special report that you must submit to the province in conjunction with basically your application to have a license to run the water system. So that regulation, as I say, will require a separate report, which will also assist the municipality with. Clean Water Act, I won't spend a lot of time with, but that really guides conservation authorities on managing water at the watershed level. And then the Water Opportunities Act really stepped in the shoes of SWISA. Need to inventory your information, need to develop a long-term financial plan. As part of that, there'll be a conservation plan, which the province will set targets. There'll also be a requirement to consider new technologies or way of saving money. And then at the end of the day, identify any potential risks to your system and provide plans for dealing with those risks. So that piece of legislation is in place. We don't have the regulations in force right now because based in my conversations with the province, they are waiting for the last bullet on that page, which is the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. That piece of legislation municipalities have to, is really the one where they have to inventory all of your assets, not only water and wastewater, but stormwater, roads, and then all of the rest of the assets, and basically come up with a plan. So over the next 3 to 5 years, the results of that plan will provide the foundation for moving ahead with that Water Opportunities Act. So in essence, the province is looking for financial stability by municipalities by ensuring they're looking at their infrastructure and they're doing all the right things to plan for the long-term maintenance and replacement of your water and wastewater assets. As we go through today, you'll see that we'll talk about replacement of your assets. That'll be in part of your capital program. So we'll deal with that for the most part, we'll be dealing with the principles of this legislation in the presentation I'll give you today. Next slide, please. So our starting point is this is your 2020 rates. And excuse me, these are what your residents pay for their water service today. On the residential side, there's a monthly charge of $18 it's a base charge. Whether you're consuming water, you're down in Florida, whatever, you're going to pay this base charge. And then in addition to it, you'll pay for the amount of water that flows through the meter. Now you have what's called an increasing block rate. So the first 15 cubic meters per month, up to that, you pay $1.69. If you go use more than that in a month, you pay almost $1.78. You go up from there, $2.22, etc. So it's increasing block because as you consume more, you pay more per cubic meter for the water. About 10% of the municipalities in Ontario use that rate similar to yourself. On the wastewater side, you have a set rate, which is $2.33. And that's based on the amount of water going through the water meter. We use the water meter as kind of a surrogate for imposing the wastewater charges. So that's our starting point, and we'll be modifying off of that as we project into the future what the potential rates will be. The next slide. It reflects your customer profile. So right now, this is the total number of customers, both residential and non-residential, that are on the system that you're servicing. You can see there's just under on the water side, at the very right-hand side of the top table, just under 4,000 residential users, and you've got about 168 non-residential users. So for a total of about 4,124 users. The green table that's below is those that are receiving municipal wastewater. And you can see it's considerably less. There are a lot of customers that even though they get water service from the municipality, they'll have to provide their own septic system, and therefore they're not hooked up to the municipal water. So you can see you've got about 1,755 residential users and just under 100 non-residential users. So we look at those customers because we need to take a look at the existing flows and the existing base charges that arise from those customers. But then we're going to forecast into the future, because we're looking out 10 years, to see how many additional customers will come on stream. So with the additional customers, they'll give us more base charge and more volume revenue through their bills. Next slide, please. So this provides for the growth forecast for the water users. And you can see, as we noted, we'll see growth within Elmville, Hillsdale, Enton Mills, Midhurst, Center, Vespera, and Snowy Valley. The largest number of customers would be arising through Midhurst. You can see that they'll give the most increase over time. So with your existing number of customers of 4,124, and we add the new customers, you'll be approaching 6,600 water customers over time. Now, from that new customer base, obviously we'll see additional flows coming through your water meters. You can see right now that we've summarized the amount coming through each of the 4 blocks. In total, your water users consume just over 900,000 cubic meters per year. Now, from the forecast above, we've looked at the average consumption water system, and it's 180 cubic meters. So every customer on average consumes about 180 cubic meters. So with those new customers on the top table, we've estimated the additional amount of flows that would be coming into the system. And you can see we moved from about 930,000 cubic meters at the beginning, and we're up to approaching 1.4 million cubic meters of billable water going through those meters. So that's the information that we'll use in order to actually calculate the rates. But first, in order to calculate the rates, we have to now take a look at your capital expenditures and your operating expenditures and see what costs are we're going to be recovering through the water meters. The next slide. This is on the wastewater side. So as I say, you've got less customers, but in total, we'd be rising from just under 1,900 users currently to about 4,100 users. You can see that the Midhurst area, once again, is giving you the most increase in your number of users. And the billable water flows, in which you're going to use for wastewater purposes, you're going from about 376,000 cubic meters up to about 777,000 cubic meters by the end of the 10 years. So you're basically doubling the amount of flows along with doubling the amount of customers. Next slide. When we're looking at financing your capital programs or looking at money available for rate stabilization, we always take a look at what your reserve position is. Your water reserves are looking relatively healthy. You've got a couple of areas that are with the development charges. You've got Midhurst, which is in a bit of a negative, and Center Vespa is in a negative as well. For the most part, if you add them together, you're in a relatively reasonable starting point. On the wastewater side, though, you can see that you're in a negative balances across all of your reserves and reserve funds. So we're running at about $800,000 deficit. Now that's something we're starting with that. You'll see that there's a sizable amount of capital. And so we're going to have to address funding of your capital program and also make up for these negative balances, because those negative balances are putting a drag on the overall finances of the municipality. Next slide. We'll talk about now the capital program over the next 10 years. Most of the program has been identified, or at least for the existing systems, been identified with the assistance of Aqua. We also have incorporated the growth-related costs, which are arising from the different engineering assessments. Basically, the development charge study laid out a number of those costs. We've looked at the timing of them, some adjustments in cost estimates, and they've been included as well. Next slide. We would identify as well that right now, your systems from an existing asset, what you're managing, you've got about $88 million in water infrastructure, and you've got about $40 million in wastewater. That's a pretty sizable amount that you are managing today. Obviously, that'll grow over time, but for today, those systems, which have been aging over time, represent roughly about $21,000 per customer on the water side and $21,000 per customer on the wastewater. So one thing to keep in mind when we take a look at the capital program and what you're managing, it's over almost $43,000 per customer to get the water into the house and then to take it away and to treat it, obviously for those that have wastewater servicing. So we always have to keep that in mind, because municipalities right now, the one area where it's putting pressure on rate increases is the capital program. And as I talked about in the first couple of slides, SWISA and the Water Opportunities Act and the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act have all focused on municipalities addressing their long-term capital program and to basically incorporate it into a longer-term financial plan. So as we come through, you'll see that the capital program will be providing an impact on your rates. Next slide. And just to put it in perspective, you can see we've kind of detailed out the level of or the different types of infrastructure within the water service and the different components of the infrastructure and the wastewater service. So you can see right now you got about $128 million in assets that you're managing. The amount that we've included in the capital program solely for replacement is about 10.7 million. So that's roughly about 8%. Over the next 10 years, what we provided for is like 8% of the assets that you have in place. If you said, okay, I'm going to keep replacing that amount in each of the 10 years, it'll take you roughly 120 years to replace your system. Your system's aging, pipes on average, depending on the how they've been maintained, the quality of the materials, etc., they last somewhere between 50 and 100 years. So as we move forward in time, those pressures arising from the need to replace the assets will become more significant. Next slide. On the water side, you can see there's reasonable amount of replacement that's needed in the first 10 years, but as we move out, you get into more sizable level of expenditures on a year-to-year basis. On the wastewater side, we see a similar type of thing. Next slide, please. And you can see, it's really focused out into the forecast, but these graphs are solely on age of the materials. They don't address the fact that there's these, depending on how they're performing, they may have to be replaced earlier. And that's where Aqua have been looking at the system, looking at performance, how our water main breaks, etc., and have been advising the municipality on a potential capital program, which is the one that we've used in order to develop this, this capital budget. Next slide. So on the wastewater side, you can see that we've got a sizable amount of infrastructure. This is the existing capital needs for each of the areas. You can see it's fairly detailed. They put a fair amount of thought into different elements of the infrastructure. And that existing totals about $6 million. On the next slide, you can see that at the bottom portion of it, we've got the growth-related costs. And you can see they're running in about, in the range of about $32 to $34 million. So in essence, there's about $6.5 million that have to be funded through rates or through reserves funds. The rest of it, for the most part, will be funded by developers. And if we look at the next slide, you can see that the tools that we have to finance it are reserves, or really transferring money from the operating budget into reserves. That's the way we've approached it, because if we put it into the reserves, we can deal with the year-to-year fluctuations. So in our analysis, we've taken it from the operating budget and transferred it directly into reserves. We've got development charges and developer contributions. So for the growth-related capital, they'll be funding the biggest portion of those costs. And if we don't have enough money in the reserves, we're going to have to fall back into debt in order to fund those capital expenditures. So I don't have the money today. It's just like a car loan, or borrow the money and I'll pay it off over, let's say, 10 years. On the next slide, this is the funding schedule that we've provided for. You can see the development charge reserves. We're going to draw about 1.2 million. So that's for most of the developers, with the exception of the Midhurst. Midhurst, we're going to look to have the developers basically construct or contribute towards the totality of those capital items. And that translates into about $37 million inflated over the next 10 years. You can see we'll need, there'll be a little bit of growth-related debt. So that's the areas that are outside of Midhurst. So just to cash flow some of those expenditures that the municipality would probably be upfronting, we'll have to issue a little bit of debt. The one that hits rates, so those first three items don't hit the rates. It'll be the water and wastewater reserves, or the water reserves in this case, where we'll need about $5.3 million from the reserves to fund the capital. So there will be money we'll be transferring from the operating budget into the capital in order to help fund this program. Next slide. Well, I guess from the operating budget into reserves and then reserves to fund the capital. The operating budget impacts, for the most part, your existing areas should be a reasonable level of growth. Almost everything obviously is impacted by inflation. So most of the items we've inflated at 2% per year. Utilities, materials, chemicals, basically those services have been increasing at a greater rate. So we've assumed 5% for those programs. We've also had to turn our minds to the sizable amount of growth which is going to occur in the Midhurst area. And basically when those new plants, those treatment facilities are coming on stream, we're going to have to obviously have Aqua service those treatment plants. So we've asked Aqua to give us some estimates. We've worked them into the analysis in a couple of different blocks, but you'll see some sizable increases in your expenditures as those new treatment facilities come on. And then there's, with those new plants, you have basically payment in lieu costs associated with the, instead of property taxes, you got payments in lieu. So those new facilities will draw some added costs as well. So we've included that. So between staff and ourselves, we've gone through a lot of detail to estimate the potential increases over the next 10 years on the operating budget. If we look at the next slide, this kind of gives you an idea of how those expenditures will be increasing. And you can see the blue is your operating expenditures. And for the first couple of years, they'll be really just impacted by the inflation that we've talked about. But then as those new plants in Midhurst open up, you can see that they'll have a sizable increase in our expenditures. So the operating costs today are about $2.1 million. By the time we get to the end of the forecast, we're looking at operating costs of about $5.1 million. Now, there's capital related expenditures. These are transfers from the operating budget into the reserves. You can see that for the first couple of years, we're in the rates that we're trying to smooth out. We are trying to transfer some money into the reserves in the front end of the forecast. The reserve transfers are negligible for the rest of the forecast period. A little bit starting to come back in 2030. So I was talking about the $5.5 million in expenditures that we'd be drawing. There's a lot of money we'll be drawing from the reserves. And most of your operating budget will be going towards just funding the day-to-day operating costs. Next slide. I'll come back to talk about the rate increases in a minute, but I'd like to talk about the wastewater program, and then I'll bring both the water and the wastewater rate impacts back for you to consider. On the wastewater side, you can see that the expenditures are in the range of about $90 million, the capital expenditures. There's a lot of that is into the growth-related component. So we're about $83 million related to growth. The residual is funding existing replacements. Once again, this is the forecast, capital forecast that we've received from Aqua to help identify our needs over the next 10 years. Next slide. Now, once again, same type of financing options that we have available, but potentially there's a sizable amount of debt that we might have to issue. And as well, we've even considered, depending on how fast we need to increase the rates in the early stages, we've added in an extra element, which is if we want to have the rates go up at a lower level, we're going to use an awful lot of external debt, and we're obviously our reserves are already in a negative. So we may consider even borrowing from the tax supported and then paying it back over time with interest. But it's one of the options if we're exhausting our external debt and we want to hold down the impact on the rates, then we need to consider borrowing from perhaps from the tax supported. So we'll with this, we've provided a couple of different options for you. Next slide. So for the most part, I've just summarized this. The operating, there will be, sorry, one point I would mention is that with Midhurst, once again, we'll have some impacts on the operating as a result of opening up those treatment facilities, but then it's really the capital program as well, which is driving some of the impacts. So what we've provided is 3 scenarios where we've tried to hold the rate increases at 5% per year. So we've both the volume and that base charge will go up at 5% for each and every customer. Now, the 5% is not only for your existing, remember, we're going to double the number of customers over time. So not only the existing customers, but all those new customers coming on will also pay these increased rates. And so on scenario number 1, we have just said, okay, if we don't do anything and just keep those reserve funds going into a negative, so we're at about 700,000 negative rate now. If we don't assist by additional debt or finding additional reserves, but just keep drilling that reserve fund into a negative, we go into over $5 million by the time we hit the end of the 5-year period. Now, scenario 2, well, what if we keep that 5% per year, but we try and service it as well with debt? Once again, we even though we're issuing debt, the reserve will fall into deficits, and will also, and that's as a result of a significant amount of debt charges being paid for by the reserves. Now, we're not in as much of a negative, but we're still in a sizable couple of $1 million negative by the time we hit the end. That's then suggesting we need to do some other matters. We've looked at the base charge increase and the volume at 5%. And then we've tried to basically do some borrowing as well, issue debt, do some borrowing, and even cash flow from loans from the tax supported. And that would all keep us within the 5%. Or the last alternative, we need to have 8% increases for the first 2 years. We'll drop it down to 6, we'll drop it down to 4. And by the time we hit the end of the forecast, we'd be trending at a 1% increase. But it's that 8% in the first year and then those bumps that help amass more revenue at the front end, which is where we need the expenditures versus the back end. Next slide, please. So this just summarizes the dollar amounts. The reserve fund balance under scenario 1 as we get to the end we're at a $5 million deficit. Option number 2, we've got, by the time we hit the end of the last year, we turn into a positive, and we've issued about $7.7 million in debt. The third option is reserves, debt, and borrowing. And then the last one identifies if we're increasing those rates, we reduce the amount of debt and we reduce the amount of reserve fund balance. Now, keep in mind when you see those year-end balances, we've also had to cover that $700,000 deficit and bring it into a positive. Next slide. So option 1, 2, and 3, you will recall that we said we would go at a 5% increase per year. The water increases are roughly at about 3% per year. So if we combine them together, so if you're just a water-only user, you'd be looking at a 3% increase. If you're a water and wastewater user, then the averages together would bring you at 4% per year. So that would be that option 1, 2, and 3 on a combined basis would be 4%. If we went with option 4, which is the one which provides the most financial stability and the most financing to address the capital, we would go with a combined rate increase of 6% for the first 3 years. It'll drop down to 5, down to 4, and then at the latter end of the forecast, we're basically at inflationary levels on the total bill. Now, once again, these bills are based on 180 cubic meters. And you can see when we talk about these levels of increase under the first 3 scenarios, you would be increasing by roughly about $50 a year combined for your water and wastewater bill. So it'd be basically $4 per month that we'd increase for the first year. Basically the same level for the next year, same level for the next year. If we look at the scenario 4, the increase is about just under $80. So we'd be looking at roughly about a $6 a month increase. And then the next year you'd have the same level of increases, and then once again it would drop off. You can see by the time we hit to 2030, we're almost at the exact same amount of the water bill. But you can see that it increases under scenario 4 a little faster on the front end. That gives us a little bit more money to deal with the capital program. Next slide, please, Daryl. So as I've noted, we've undertaken the analysis. We've provided an opportunity to share with you some of the issues we need to deal with on the wastewater side. And we're happy to seek your guidance before we finalize the study, which would identify all the different components and provide the recommendations for council's consideration. So through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy enough to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scanlon. Very comprehensive, a lot to digest there. Before we get to questions, can I have a mover and seconder to get this on the floor, please? Councillor Moore and Councillor Maude Chapman. Before I open it up to comments, questions, CAO Schmidt, do you have any initial comments or input before we go straight to questions, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to members of council. So some of you may recall, previous council members, we did do a rate study back in 2017 with the intent that we would be coming back in 2020 with what you're seeing here tonight. So at that time, I believe the council had agreed that rate increases for water would remain at a 0% for essentially 2018, 19, and 2020. And then there would be an increase in the wastewater, which is what we've implemented thus far. And of course, due to, as Mr. Scanlon indicated, the idea is that the township is going through some growth. And, we are probably in a position where we would likely have to come back in 2 to 3 years' time subsequent to this to have council take another look at the rate study to ensure that rates are at the right level. So beyond that, again, happy to answer any questions that members of the council may have regarding tonight's study.
Just as an overview, the scenario 4 seems to hit the present residents. It's front end loaded with a higher percentage increase. Doesn't it seem more realistic to wait for the growth? Well, to have the 5% increase is or lesser than the 8% increases initially, and wait for the growth to happen in the next 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years before you when the number of people will be able to share the burden, an increased number of people because of the houses being built and residents moving into the township. Mr. Scanlon?
For you, Mr. Mayor, that's something that we were trying to achieve with the 5% increase, was to keep the level of increase on the wastewater rates as low as possible. It's just that in looking at the capital works that need to be addressed, many of them are front-ended in the forecast. We've had discussions with our public works staff as well as with Aqua, and maybe there's a bit of an ability to slow it down a little bit. But from the initial forecast we have actually significantly revised the timing of the infrastructure. So that would then say, in theory, to achieve it by expenditure adjustments, you'd be increasing your risk of something happening. So, the potential of, pumps breaking down or such. So it's a performance issue. So it's a trade-off between revenue management versus expenditure management. And the expenditure management, as I say, we've massaged from the initial information that we were getting from Aqua.
Okay. All right. I'll open it to council. Questions, comments? Councillor Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. To echo your comments there, that's the one difficulty I have with scenario number 4, and be nice to see if scenario number 4 would be able to be modified some way by utilizing some of the other tools so that it wasn't so difficult for our current customers as opposed to benefiting those down the road. So I'd be really interested in seeing something along those lines that might mitigate the hit to the existing customers.
Well, as I say, we've offered 3 different scenarios. I think option 3, then doing some internal borrowing would assist you, but that means you've got some reserves on your tax supported side, and we would be borrowing from those reserves, and which is fine. I mean, that's perhaps an easier way of doing it. But keep in mind that if you have some significant expenditures that you're making elsewhere in parks, recreation, roads, those funds have been loaned over to the wastewater side for a few years until they can be repaid. So it's an option, Councillor, that's obviously available. And that's why we put it forth as one of the scenarios.
So that would be option
3.
2 or 3?
Yes, 3. Option 3 does the internal borrowing.
Right. But still requires $606,000 from tax supported reserves, right?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Other comments? Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Through you to CAO Schmidt. On this slide back near the beginning, where it was showing the deficits, Center Vespra was listed as $200,000+. I'm wondering, is that any money that's coming back to the township from the developer, or is there any of that deficit funding coming back to us? Thank you.
Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Moore. So that is a development charge deficit. And so, yes, as the developer, and they do have, I can't remember how many units they still have left to pull building permits. As they pull those building permits, we will be charging them a development charge, which would go to help offset that deficit.
Follow on?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. And secondly, sorry, when Mr. Scanlon was speaking about the cost per resident, and I'll get the figures wrong, so I apologize, but between $20,000 and $40,000 per resident, I'm just curious to know if that is a standard amount. Are we higher than our comparable size municipality, or are we lower? Thank you.
I can answer that through you, Mr. Mayor. So the figures were roughly $21,500 per water and $21,500 per wastewater. So you total them together is $43,000. If I look at places like in York region or Halton region, et cetera, where they have denser development, then their investment per customer is probably in the range of $25,000. As you get outside of those areas, and as the areas of development are more dispersed, and maybe the densities aren't quite the same. Obviously, if in a place like Burlington, if your lot sizes or your frontage is 25 feet, then you need a lot less pipe to get the water to that house. If in your community the frontages are 40 feet, then you can see how there's extra costs. So all of that plays into that figure of 43,000. So I do see numbers in excess of $35,000 quite often in municipalities of a similar nature as yourself. So you're not different. You're right in with the rest of the group.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Scanlon, you said at the beginning in the water rates that the way we charge water rates is the same as about 10% of municipalities. What about the other 90%? What methodology do they use?
So on your base charge, 85% of municipalities that have meters will charge that monthly amount. So let's say a very high proportion do what you do and charge that monthly amount. On the volume rates, about 10% have that increasing block. So that helps to promote conservation. And there's about 10% that do this decreasing block, which if they have high volume users like a Coca-Cola plant or something, they may give a discount to those high volume users. And then really for the most part, most of them use what's called a constant rate, which is if I consume 1 cubic meter, I'm going to pay $1.50. If I can consume 1 million, I'm going to pay $1.50 per cubic meter. So a constant just means it's the same rate. It's like what your wastewater rate is. That's a constant rate.
Okay. Councillor Cabral.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Mayor Allen. I'm just curious, in comparison to other municipalities, given exactly what you've said, where we have some communities that are very small and tight knit, and then other communities where, we have homes with significant sized lots, sometimes an acre or more. Are there any other municipalities that would have what, I don't know what to call it, like a rolling rate, depending on where you are located in the municipality, given the amount of funds that are required to operate that system in that community?
Yes, there is, through you, Mr. Mayor. We call it more area specific rates, right? So that in one community, you may be paying $1 per cubic meter. In another community, you might be paying $2 a cubic meter. And we do the calculations. Historically, when municipalities were being amalgamated, under, I think you went through an amalgamation in the 90s, the councils of the day tried to keep those rates kind of separated. But over time, many of the municipalities have basically gone with one individual rate. And if our firm does any type of rate calculation, area rating, we would submit that the operating costs, we would break the rates into an operating component and then a capital component. Because everybody, depending on how your system's running, it's very difficult to say, well, you only pay a certain amount for that area, because if you have a water main break, all the crews go over there to deal with the water main break. And then there might be some other type of emergency at a water treatment plant. So generally they would pay the same for the operating, but then we'd vary it based on the capital component. But I would say, once again, a very high proportion do a common rate across all the areas that receive that service.
So CEO Schmidt, then what are the next steps with respect to this? Is this something that we further consider and talk to you about and then bring up again in budget time, or give me the process and time frame going forward, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the idea is that instead of bringing a final report to council this evening, due to the challenges that are being discussed this evening, we wanted to make sure that council was aware of some of these issues and to try to get some feedback from you and try to get some kind of direction, if you will, as to what you'd like to see going forward in a final report, which we were proposing we will be coming back on November 18th with a final report to try to finalize the water and wastewater rate study. So really, we're kind of looking for some direction from council as to those scenarios as it relates to the wastewater and the water, getting some feedback, which I think we've gotten some, but I'm not sure that we have full direction as to what you'd like to see come back in a final report. The idea would be and then once that's finalized, that would be establish the rates for 2021 moving forward until we decide to update or amend the rate study. So it essentially would solidify, if you will, the water and wastewater component of our budget for this year, and would provide direction for council or upcoming councils as it relates to future year increases based on what's provided in the final report.
Okay, well, I think for myself, and then we'll certainly get input from the rest of council, that I'd like to review this and ask more questions before, and then be able to provide more substantive input or reaction. And can I hear from the rest of council on that matter? Councillor Cabral?
Thank you, Mary Ellen. As much as scenario 4 seems to take us where we want to go, I do think it disadvantages the people now who are paying into it versus the people who are going to be coming on board down the road. I wonder if we might look at including a component possibly for the Midhurst secondary plan for some of these new developments where maybe their rate gives us an opportunity moving forward, I think, to maybe look at having a different rate in different areas for the new developments so that the present taxpayers or wastewater water users aren't the ones that are footing the bill up front. I just think that would be maybe a consideration that we could look at.
CEO Schmidt?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just maybe to clarify, and if I'm misspeaking, Gary, by all means, please tell me. I think you know there's questions tonight, or there's concerns tonight that we're front-ending things with regards to the wastewater. Keep in mind, our reserves are already in a deficit, and they're going to get even more into a deficit. And some of that is due to Midhurst coming on board, but we're already in a deficit. So the current users of the system are already in a deficit position. And there are capital needs that have to happen in the next couple of years, not Midhurst, due to our existing infrastructure, so Elmville specifically, that have to be addressed. And those users should be paying for those capital infrastructure needs that are going to happen very shortly. So just keep in mind that, again, it's not just based on Midhurst coming on board and that's the big pressure. We already have a pressure on our wastewater system today as it is. We're in a deficit and we need to address that. And the existing users, in my mind, should be paying for some of that. They are benefiting from the system.
Follow on, please, Mayor Allen.
Yes, go ahead.
Real quick. I'm not just pointing the finger at Midhurst. I'm thinking maybe we should be looking at this for all the areas if possible. I'm just saying that Midhurst does present an opportunity coming down the pipe to kind of look at that too, because if we go with scenario number 4, yeah, we'll be digging it out with the present ones, like you're saying, we're already in a deficit. But when you look 4 or 5 years down the road, that does present an opportunity at that time. That's kind of where I'm going. I'm not saying it's a must do. I just wouldn't mind seeing something that kind of looked at it. That's all.
CAO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, maybe what I could propose to members of council is similar to what we did in the 2017 rate study is that if you're accepting of a 5% increase on the base and the volume for 21 and 22, let's say, with the intent that staff comes back in 2022 in time for 2023 to look at the rates and see where things are at again. Because again, I think over the next couple of years, things are going to change fairly rapidly. And again, the assumptions that we're using within this study are going to change. They are based on what we know today, but that could change tomorrow or 3, a year down the road, right? So that is another approach that we could take, is just simply go with a 5% rate increase on the wastewater side and take another look at this in 2023, let's say. That's another option that I throw out there.
We have Deputy Mayor Coughlin and Councillor Hanna, and I don't see other cards now, but we have 15 minutes till our next meeting. So Councillor Moss after that. So go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
Yes, thank you. Mine's brief and I can potentially wait, but I did find in our last session that the information that was provided based on each individual facility was quite beneficial, because I too had the mindset of a user pay system, but we do have systems that are running at like 12% capacity, and in order to displace that onto individual areas, it would just become infeasible for some people. So I believe it's Phelpston that, the capacity on that system, if the users were to pay for that on their own, would not be feasible. But I did appreciate the information of the last one. It gave a really good understanding of how each of our systems work, the costs associated with them. And we were even provided the opportunity to tour the facilities to get a firsthand knowledge of it. So I found that beneficial and still use that today. So maybe that would be an option for us as well.
Thank you. Councillor Hanna.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess through you to CEO Schmidt. I would be more in favor if it's possible. Obviously, we got to do a 4 or 5% race across the board, but put more of an impact on the high-end users, those who choose to water the sprinkler system every night and so on. That's an option that they choose to do. And I would just rather see, when it comes forward to budget, if we don't have to make a decision tonight, but if we could think about just a basic increase, but a higher rate of increase on the big end users.
CEO Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So a couple of things there, I guess, Councillor Hanna, sorry, is that as we noted, the water volume charge is based on a tiered rate. So the more water you use, the more you pay. So there is that kind of disincentive, if you will, for those users not to consume as much. I will note that through the 2017 study, we had an open house. There was probably close to 100 people that attended the public open house here at the Township Administration Center, and their concerns were that they didn't feel that if they watered their grass or they washed their car, that they should be penalized, because that's not really, that water's not going back through the system and being treated through the wastewater system. It's essentially filtering into the ground. So due to some of those concerns, we ended up moving away from an increasing block, which we had previously on the wastewater side, similar to the water, and we moved to this constant rate, which essentially, no matter how much water they use, If you consume 180 cubic meters, for example, then you pay that constant charge for wastewater on that 180 cubic meters. So we did take a look at that through the last rate study. Some individuals are still not happy about that. But as you can see, our wastewater is in a bit of a dire straits, if you will, and we need to address it. So, it's something we could take a look at, and do we re-implement an increasing block on the wastewater? You are going to get more questions from some of your higher users in some of the other areas of the township, whereby they feel that they shouldn't be having to pay additional cost for wastewater when it's not necessarily being treated, if you will.
Councillor Ma?
Thank you, Mayor Allen. And it's just a question or my thought, not to change anyone, not to change Mr. Scalen's idea. I understand with option 4, and I understand where we're going with the forecast. And we probably need to go that route. But is there a way, instead of starting at 8 and finishing at 1, if you started at 6 for a couple years, instead of going down 1% each time, you can stay at 6 for 3 years, 5 for 3 years, 3 for 3 years? Would we come to the same forecast at the end?
Mr. Scanlon?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we would, yeah, we could take a look at that one. I think we'll run in the early stages. We'll run some further deficits. So the higher increases to 6%, we could go with some internal borrowing. So maybe blending option 3 and 4 together. So you'll be borrowing less, and the rates won't be going up as much. So that could be certainly an option for us to consider, Councillor.
Okay, can I suggest then that we revisit the report with the discussion we've had and get feedback and questions to Jeff, and that we then can talk about this next council meeting or next budget, in our first budget meeting, to hash possibilities, and maybe through input to Jeff, get some reworking of scenarios along the lines of what we've been talking about. Okay, so we have a mover and seconder for the recommendation that the presentation from Watson and Associates regarding the water and wastewater rate study be received. All those in favor? That is carried. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for the presentation, and we'll be looking forward to following up with you.
Thank you.
Mover and seconder for the confirmatory bylaw, please. Councillor Cabral, Deputy Mayor Coughlin, that the bylaw 2020-89 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of the council's at the special meeting held on November 4, 2020, listed herein, be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? Carried. And a mover and seconder for adjournment, please. Councillor Cabral, Councillor Moore. The special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 6:18 p.m. to meet again a regular meeting on November 4th at 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Thanks again.
You still there, Renee?